in this lesson, I want to show you another way that we can think about our current problem with the user form, and that is representing its two different modes, the login mode and the registration mode. Right now, we have a single text state property that represents the text on our button. And I would argue this is not really sufficient for holding the logic of what mode you are in. Eventually, our form is going to diverge depending on the mode that the user is in. There's, for example, going to be additional input fields that are going to be present in the registration mode that are not going to be present in the login mode. And simply having a piece of property called text isn't really sufficient to capture that higher level idea. So how we define state is up to us, and how we want to model this is also up to us. For example, I can create a mode piece of state that can be a string like login or sign up. That is a totally valid approach. But what we're going to do is something a little bit more looser and lighter than that. I propose that we simply add a property here called login mode, and I'm going to initialize it to be a Boolean, and it's going to be true in this case. So the way I want this to work is that login mode will be true when the user is in the login mode. And when the user switches to the sign-up mode, I'm going to flip this login mode state property to be false. And by using that value, we're going to be able to monitor what state the form is in and render the corresponding dynamic elements. So depending on whether we are in login mode or not, we're going to vary up many different things that appear in the UI. But this is kind of more descriptive than simply checking for a piece of text being equal to something, right? It's kind of a higher level descriptive category, a more explanatory piece of state compared to just a random text property, right? So what I want to do now is move through our event handlers and change them so that whenever the user clicks one of these two buttons, we're going to either move the form into login mode or into registration mode. So right here in handle login click, we can get rid of our former console log that was just left over from the previous lesson, which means we no longer need the event parameter here either. And here, rather than updating text, I'm instead going to say that I want to update the login mode state property. And since this is going to be a login click, I want to change this to true. All right, so if the user is in login mode and they click handle login click, nothing is going to change because the state will just go from true to true. But right here in handle sign up click, which is going to be run whenever the user clicks the sign up button right here, I'm going to update once again the login mode property, but this time around it's going to be false. All right, now you might be curious, doesn't this mean that we should also update the text piece of state, because that is something that is dependent on what mode we are in? And I would argue that that is actually not a great idea, because whenever you have two dependent pieces of state that change with each other, it's generally not a good idea to have to manually update them, because there are more elegant solutions to that problem in React. So in this case, our text that we have appearing on the button, you could say is dependent on what this property is equal to. If we know that login mode is true, this text should be one thing. And if login mode is false, this text should be something different. So it is a dependent or derived or computed piece of state. It is based on something else. And for something like that, a much more elegant solution, rather than bloating up your state, is to simply put that conditional logic into your render method, because we know that our render method will rerun every time our primary piece of state changes. So here's what that code will look like. I'm going to get rid of text right here, right? And then here in render, we now only have one property that we can destructure off of this.state, and it is now login mode. However, we are still relying on text right here, and we can see that ESLint violation because JavaScript doesn't know what text is. But now, rather than text living in state, I'm simply going to declare a constant inline called text. And I'm going to use the current value of login mode to determine what that text should be equal to. So I'm going to reference login mode. I'm going to use a ternary expression. So if login mode is true, then my text should be login into account, because we are in login mode, and that is what I want to be on the button. And if login mode is false, our text should instead be register. So this is going to accomplish the exact same effect as having text be in state, because whenever the user clicks any of our buttons and runs the corresponding method, we are going to update state using setState. Whenever that happens, we of course will force a component re-render. At that point, login mode will change to be true or false or back and forth again. But regardless of which one it is, we're going to calculate the next value of text right here before we return to JSX. So text will still be dynamic. It's still going to be one of these two values, but rather than keeping this logic in our state and creating a lot of bloat and a lot of additional properties, we can simply calculate it in our render because it is dependent on what login mode is. We don't want to hold all this additional dependent state in state because that means every time we update login mode, we also have to update text. We have to remember to do that if text is a state property. Now we don't have to remember to have that additional side effect because text will automatically recalculate or refigure it out itself simply because it's going to be calculated in render each time the component re-renders itself. And that is the general strategy that you're going to see in the React ecosystem. Whenever you have state that is based off other pieces of state or dependent or derived from, don't duplicate that logic. Just simply place it in render and base it off the core kind of initial starter piece of state that you care about, which in our case is login mode, right? Don't put a greater burden on yourself to update multiple state properties if you can get away with only updating one, as we are in this case. Login mode is all we need to figure out text, so there's no reason to put text in state and have to be reminded to update it each time we, for example, handle a login click or handle a sign up click. So hopefully that makes sense. And the only other thing I want to show you is that the form is going to work as expected. So we're going to kick off in login mode, which means we're going to see the text log into account right here. When I click sign up, we're going to run the handle sign up method that is going to change login mode to false. That is going to trigger a re-render, which will change the text to register. We see it right here. And now as I click back to login, we go back into login to account. So each of these clicks is updating state. And as a consequence of that is also forcing a re-render and triggering the button text to change. So we have the exact same effect, but now we have a higher level login mode state property, which we can use for a lot more dynamism, because now we can continue to rely on that login mode property right here to dynamically customize the JSX that is going to be returned each time the render method runs. All right, so I think we're moving into a better direction with how we're modeling the mode or the version that the form is in. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.